Operation Killer was the name General Matthew Ridgway chose for a counteroffensive to capitalize on the routing of Chinese Communist forces by the 8th Army in the early months of 1951. Army Chief of Staff General Joseph Collins expressed concern over Ridgway's choice of names, arguing the word killer might not go over well with the media. Ridgway disagreed.
I am by nature opposed to any effort to sell war to people as an only mildly unpleasant business that requires very little in the way of blood.
He declined to dilute the intent of the operation by changing the name. Before Operation Killer began on 20 February 1951, Ridgway prioritized the rearming and refitting of his soldiers whose supplies had dwindled as a result of recent actions against the Chinese Communist forces. Ridgway was familiar with General Douglas MacArthur's dictum that
the index of modern war is not manpower, but materiel.
Colonel Paul Freeman's example is illustrative. As the commander of the 23rd Regimental Combat Team at Chip Yung Ni, he stockpiled so much ammunition in preparation for the defense of the famous crossroads that he proclaimed,
"If we had ever left there without a fight, I might have got myself into trouble for hoarding."
Yet Colonel Freeman's troops expended virtually every shell on the massed infantry assaults of the Chinese soldiers that eventually attacked their position. Since the intervention of Chinese Communist forces in late 1950, the United Nations Command found itself primarily fighting defensive actions in Korea. Ridgway realized a pattern. The Chinese and North Korean forces continually attacked until they reached their culminating point. They then faded into the surrounding countryside to regroup and rearm. Army Doctrine Publication 5-0 explains that a culminating point is the point at which a force no longer has the capability to continue its form of operations, offense or defense. Ridgway developed Operation Killer to interrupt their operational tempo and regain tactical contact. Instead of allowing the Chinese time to rest, rearm, and reorganize, he planned to encircle and destroy their forces while they were operationally disorganized, using the hammer of 9th Corps on the west of the Han River against the anvil of 10th Corps situated to their east. Army Doctrine Publication 3-90 emphasizes that commanders should not wait too long to transition from defensive operations to offensive operations as an enemy force approaches its culminating point. Enemy forces will be dispersed, extended in depth, and weakened. At that time, any enemy defensive preparations will be hasty, and enemy forces will not be adequately prepared for defense. Planning this transition to the offense, General Ridgway recognized that he would have to adjust his priority of supply. Field Manual 3-0 states that, during large-scale combat operations, supply lines of communication are strained, and requirements for repair and replacement of weapon systems increase. Requirements for petroleum, oils, and lubricants increase during the offense. Conversely, requirements for munitions tend to be higher in the defense than in the offense. During the early phases of planning for the rearming and refitting of the 8th Army for Operation Killer, the mission appeared simple enough. However, Korea's extreme weather conditions intervened and, combined with the mountainous landscape, precluded any chance of an uncomplicated launch on 21 February 1951. To overcome these obstacles, the 8th Army developed a number of innovations to resupply and support its soldiers. As addressed in FM 3-0, the variety and complexity of possible situations arising during an attack requires sustainment operators to establish a flexible and tailorable distribution system in support of tactical commanders. At the time, the major supply depots for the U.S. Army operating in Korea existed across the Korean Strait in Japan. Given the adverse weather, extended lines of communication, and treacherous terrain, aerial resupply often proved the most responsive way for sustainers to transport critical supplies to frontline troops. Even with airdrops, vehicles were always the primary method of ensuring sustainability by supplying bulk logistics to the front line. Unsurprisingly, the enemy routinely targeted the local roads being used for the main supply routes, or MSRs, leaving U.S. Army engineers to either repair them or build new ones. As Ridgway's forces advanced through the hills during Operation Killer, engineers from the 13th Engineer Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were kept busy ensuring the MSRs remained open. Once logistics packages arrived at their destination, various methods were used to distribute supplies. Army doctrine describes two methods for tactical supply distribution: service station resupply and tailgate resupply. During service station resupply, vehicles move individually or in small groups to a centrally located resupply point. Depending on the tactical situation, one vehicle or section or even an entire platoon moves out of its position, conducts resupply operations, and then moves back into position. During tailgate resupply, combat vehicles remain in their positions or back out a short distance to allow trucks carrying Class 3 and Class 5 supplies to reach them. Tailgate resupply usually requires significantly more time than service station operations. Usually, the company uses the tailgate method only when the tactical mission allows or dictates. Since the hills could be very steep, engineers would build ad hoc staircases to help facilitate the movement of supplies uphill. Members of the Korean Service Corps were then employed to carry up to 60 pounds of supplies this way, even up sharp inclines during the rainy season. The U.S. Army routinely involved members of the Korean Service Corps to assist in the distribution of everything from sea rations and mail to ammunition and medical supplies. Founded on mutually concluded agreements, relationships such as these remain vital to U.S. Army operations. Today, potential host nation support agreements may address labor support, port and terminal operations, transportation support, bulk petroleum distribution and storage, and the possible supply of Class 3 and Class 4 items. In some locations, the conditions were even more hazardous and were too steep for climbing or accurate airdrops. Here, the same engineers designed what they called a cable car, which utilized a diesel truck engine to move up to 400 pounds of supplies along cables to line companies dug in on the front's ridgelines. Each car worked on a simple system of pulleys. Coordination between the loading station and the top of the hill was by landlines strung up the hillside. It took 4.5 minutes to ascend 2,000 feet. Trying to physically climb the same area with a 60-pound load would have taken a soldier several hours. Once the car arrived atop the hill, a rudimentary yet organized system of soldiers carrying the supplies took over. The cable car and distribution lines carried more than supplies. They also assisted in casualty evacuation and, in doing so, enabled 8th Army to maintain its momentum. Current Army doctrine states that casualty evacuation must occur concurrently with operations, and units that cease aggressive maneuver while in contact with the enemy risk suffering additional casualties and failing the mission. The formidable terrain and unrelenting enemy pressure complicated casualty evacuation and required flexibility and improvisation to ensure success. Despite these challenges, medical evacuation procedures took a giant leap forward during the Korean War with the use of helicopters and mobile Army surgical hospitals, or MASH units. The 8th Army trained its soldiers in standard medical evacuation procedures that began by signaling the need for a medevac helicopter with the detonation of a smoke grenade on the landing zone. Soldiers then carried the wounded to the helicopter and strapped them onto a stretcher attached to the landing skid. An aerodynamic hood was then mounted over their heads. The hood not only deflected the wind generated by the 80-mile-per-hour flight to the closest MASH unit, but also restricted the patient's view to keep them calm and reassured. Upon arrival at the MASH unit, teams of nurses and doctors diagnosed and administered basic treatment. Once stable, the wounded soldiers could then be moved to more permanent hospital headquarters in Japan for more in-depth treatment or rehabilitation. Depending on the circumstances, the soldiers could then either return to the front in Korea or, in more serious cases, be sent back to the United States. Sometimes, battlefront conditions or poor weather prevented helicopter evacuations. Consequently, soldiers used whatever means available to evacuate the wounded. This included tanks, jeeps, and stretchers. While expedient, this method is not without risk. ATP 4-25.13 explains, The management of CASEVAC using non-medical evacuation assets is difficult to control. Prior to moving a casualty, it is important to know where the casualty needs to go. This may be determined by the severity of injuries, number of casualties, and availability of the medical treatment facility. Because en route medical care is not provided, the duration of travel that the casualty can withstand without their condition deteriorating must be a consideration. Logistics also played a major role in maintaining morale during the Korean War by supplying some of the comforts of home for the soldiers at the front. Ridgway approved the development of recreational support facilities for his soldiers to include everything from showers to ad hoc coffee shops. These facilities operated effectively because of communication and coordination between the rear supply echelons of the 8th Army and frontline units. As addressed in ATP 4-0.1, in the early stages of an operation, essential exchange stocks may be turned over to the theater supply system. Class 6 items forwarded to the theater are based on personnel strength figures. Health and comfort packs provide everyday necessities when a field exchange is not available. As the theater matures and conditions permit, exchange activities can be established or expanded and a wider variety of items can be sold. Large-scale combat operations rely heavily upon available technology to meet the logistical demands of decisive action. However, it is instructive to consider how leaders, during earlier conflicts and with less sophisticated technology, organize their sources of supply to overcome the inherent obstacles of weather, terrain, and a dedicated enemy. Operation Killer ended on 6 March 1951 after the 8th Army regained territory lost to the Chinese Communist forces in 1950. In organizing the 8th Army to go on the offensive in Korea during Operation Killer, Ridgway thoroughly prepared his soldiers by providing them the tools necessary to meet Killer's goals of engaging and destroying the enemy. He did this by setting clear standards, outlining realistic goals, and allowing his officers and non-commissioned officers to innovate in the field for the resupply and critical care of their soldiers as they advanced against enemy forces.